how do you shed the golden handcuffs? Well, it's really tough. And if you're not familiar with the golden handcuffs, it's this concept that you end up at a job that pays so well that even if the life, the experience, your kind of overall living situation isn't great, it's hard to leave it because you get paid so much money. And Craig James is who I'm sitting down with today. He's the founder of DWELLOptimal, had this experience of having to break the golden handcuffs and go solve a problem that he experienced himself working on Wall Street and spending time over in Hong Kong for over a decade. And I won't go into too much of how he developed DWELLOptimal, but it's a really interesting solution that helps companies provide great living and workspaces for their employees. And so you're going to hear his own story and journey of crafting this company and the challenges that he's faced along the way. So without further ado, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Silicon Alley podcast featuring the Craig James. Are you interested in growing and scaling your business? Welcome to the Silicon Alley podcast, where you'll hear from entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and top performers on what it truly takes to grow and scale a business. You'll walk away with actionable insights you can apply in your own business and life. Now to William Glass, the CEO and co-founder of Ostrich, and your host of the Silicon Alley podcast. Craig, welcome to the Silicon Alley podcast. Super excited to have you on today.
Hey, hi, Will. Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we connected through SLP, which is an awesome program. So excited to sit down with another fellow. And I definitely want to get into your area of expertise, talk about your time on Wall Street, talk about what you're doing at DWELLOptimal. But I actually like to start somewhere a little more personal. So you mentioned in your bio and when you were doing your entrepreneurial journey, which was this kind of intro that we did through SLP, that you're an avid fisherman. You love going on outdoor adventures. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and why you love the outdoors and the type of adventures that you like to go on?
Sure. I mean, first off, I'd just throw out there, I'm from Wisconsin originally. I was raised by wolves. Most people in New York think anybody from the Midwest was raised by wolves, but my father was an avid fisherman. So a little bit of a chip off the old block syndrome. We would go fishing a lot as a kid, and I guess I never lost the passion for it. I try to get around the world, really. I mean, I've fished Northern Australia. I've fished all over the country. Alamorada is an area that I fished out pretty good. So it doesn't matter as long as I can put a pole in the water, I'm fine.
Awesome. I love that. So Craig, talk to me about how you ended up on Wall Street, right? I think if I remember correctly, you had a dream of being an astronaut. Wall Street, astronaut, not quite the same thing.
You have preferential information because of our SLP upbringings here. But yeah, taking it way back, I mean, as a kid, I actually dreamed of being an astronaut. The space program, this is dating me a bit, was still in full motion. And there was this, growing up, you think big, you dream big, and being an astronaut was what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, I didn't have the eyesight to even consider it, and I ended up going conventional, if you will, going to business school, ultimately working on Wall Street for 20 plus years. I'm a bit of an unorthodox, I guess, founder entrepreneur, because most people that are in my position don't leave the golden handcuff scenario. But I finally was able to sort of break through to the other side. But yeah, Wall Street was a good run. I learned a lot. I learned what I didn't know. And, it's been a journey of learning. Let's put it that way.
That makes a lot of sense. What would you say, Craig, that you didn't know, right? As you said, there's golden handcuffs, right? You end up on Wall Street. A lot of people try really hard to make it there. You spent a lot of time there. You had this great opportunity. What was it that actually led you down this entrepreneurial path? And yeah.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if I can point to any one thing, Will. I will say that, growing up, I often say that Wall Street is, obviously in many respects can be a very lucrative experience for people, but it's very difficult, at least I found it very difficult to find any sort of personal, creative, outlet as it relates to, and at the end of the day, what I was doing is I was taking $1 and trying to make $1.20 out of it. And as I like to tell people, if you do that and you do that consistently, they'll write a book about you one day. Alternatively, if you take $1 and make 80 cents off, you're not going to last very long. So, I think a lot of traders, and that's what I was, they have good years and bad years. The great traders have consistently good years, start hedge funds, do other things. But by and large, the business of making money off money, I just didn't find it to be that creative in nature. Some people love it. Some people, get out of bed every day and ultimately that's what drives them. I think for me, I wanted to really build a business. And the one thing that Wall Street, it's hard to afford you, I guess, to some degree, is that building a business sort of position because a lot of this has been done and been done for a long time. So that's really why I got out of my seat, got uncomfortable quickly, and started along this path of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, no, I love that, Craig. And yeah, that makes sense, right? Make a dollar out of 20. Yeah, make $1.20. It's not necessarily the most creative endeavor, not for everyone. And as you said, over the years, you were on Wall Street for a long time. So I can see how you would be searching for something a little bit more creative. What was it that you were searching for, and what actually led you to start DWELLOptimal?
Well, in my last sort of stop, I spent 8 years in Asia. I was commissioned by one of the large investment banks to run equity derivatives over in Hong Kong. And I sort of lived the problem, right? I got off the plane. I'd never set foot in Asia. And lo and behold, I'm working, 15 to 16-hour days at times, and going back to an apartment. And in my situation, I lived in what they call a corporate service department. There, if you've spent any time in Hong Kong or in some of these expat cities, they have a very sophisticated service department industry. When I got back to the States after hanging up my spurs in 2015, I realized that New York in particular didn't have sort of the telemetry for effective service departments. They had some legacy products that are good, but legacy all the same. And I just felt like there was room for an updated, tech-enabled, extended stay format and application for business travel, really. Because having lived that problem, it is so nice to go back to a unit, an apartment, if you will, and have everything sort of taken care of you, almost like a hotel style. And interestingly enough, if you go back to sort of early 2010, Airbnb did a lot. Clearly, they're the 800-pound gorilla in the vacation travel realm, and building out the platform to allow sort of peer-to-peer apartment sharing. But I didn't feel like, from a technology perspective in particular, and even in a design perspective, that there was a lot done to sort of modernize the business travel experience. So that's really what we're up to DWELLOptimal, to build a better mousetrap for business travel and direct to corporations to enable effective hybrid work. And that's been my mission. I live the problem. I stayed in a hotel apartment, if you will, for 5 out of the 8 years that I was in Asia. So I think a lot of opportunities to understand and beta test and A/B test what's right and what's wrong with that sort of environment.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Craig. And as you said, living the problem, I think definitely makes it easier, gives you a unique perspective, and having actually felt it, you can really empathize with your customer base and understand what it is the experience that you can really try to create. And obviously, with the pandemic and COVID-19 and everything else, the hybrid environment and creating places where you can work at home and feel comfortable, especially if you're traveling, is becoming even more important and critical today than it ever has been.
Well, and it's funny you say that, Will, because that's just it. I mean, COVID obviously has everybody thinking hybrid and remote these days. But when I conceived of Dwell, it really was born out of that experience living in a hotel for as long as I did. And it had really nothing to do with the pandemic. I obviously wasn't predicting that we'd be living in caves for 2 years and out the other side would be hybrid work. What we were up to back in early 2018 when we started conceiving of this was, we saw the bigger technology companies like Facebook and Google look at real estate and say, hey, the biggest impediment to hiring a knowledge worker these days isn't so much the salary you give them, but there's a housing shortage in some of these tier 1 cities. So what we saw early, I think we saw it early, was the fact that Google and others were out there on the offensive, acquiring real estate to offer as an attraction retention tool. So really, the reason that we looked at building Dwell had more to do with technology innovation and the haves using that as an offensive strategy, and also looking at the fact that remote work could be facilitated by things like Zoom and Slack that were early days. Now they're sort of required materials for effective remote work. But back in the, say, 18, 19 pre-pandemic, I'd say, maybe 50% of the people were what I would call Zoom literate. Now it'd be difficult to find somebody outside of my father that doesn't know how to turn on a Zoom. So, you have a lot of people that now are effectively working remotely. We think they can be more effective. That's why we developed Dwell.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, Craig. And yeah, obviously, it sounds like have benefited from some of the things that have changed in the marketplace. Can you give me some perspective? So is Dwell actually owning the real estate, or are you partnering? Like, talk to me about how Dwell actually works. I'm
Sure.
curious to kind of get some clarity on that piece.
We have a couple of different flavors that we're bringing to market, and none of this is particularly innovative. And I'm not claiming that there's a lot in the way of economic innovation as a result to our model. I mean, if you think back at space as a service, WeWork being sort of the glaring example of this. The early days of co-working involved, the master lease and 10-year obligations and unfunded lease obligations that ultimately ended badly. I mean, when we looked at when we were building out sort of our business plan and our economic model for this, I didn't want a piece of a heavy asset intensive business that involves signing long-term master leases, because it's great when times are good, but obviously when times are tough and there's economic contraction, it becomes onerous and potentially fatal. And so what we're looking to do is to partner with both the developer on the multifamily side and the corporate to sit in between and effectively novate and/or facilitate this real estate as a service model. All that to say, what I'm really up to, or what we're really up to, is we want to build out these and design effective hybrid working units, pair them with our software, which is proprietary, and then offer that up as a service to the corporate. The multifamily residential developer gets credit enhancement in the form of a better credit and potentially yield enhancement in the form of a higher rent. What we get is essentially what amounts to be a membership fee from the corporation. So without delving in too deeply, that's essentially what we're up to.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Craig. And yeah, I think seeing what happened to WeWork with all their, as you said, their master leases, and then having month to month on the other side from the consumer side, they got just absolutely hammered at the very beginning of this. So you can see why it makes sense, the approach that you're taking. And
well, economically, I would say it was a bit suicidal, but I want to give credit where credit is due. I mean, Adam Newman and company took an idea really, and they were the first to do it, and really sort of shrink wrapped that pixie dust to create a movement and ultimately a revolution in real estate. Financially, I think that anybody can look at this and say, with the benefit of hindsight, it was a difficult exercise for them. They righted the ship to a large degree, but I take nothing away from their innovation. I mean, I had a friend when I worked at one of the hedge funds I worked at. We had an individual who was an analyst that went early days. I think it was 2012. Moved over to WeWork, and I think most people didn't know WeWork existed in 2012. And he was, they had WeWork Camp, and he was all about it. I heard about it early, and what they were able to do rather was truly incredible. So financially, yes, I mean, anybody could look at that and say there were repercussions as associated with the business model, but what they were able to do in the way of space as a service and truly being the revolutionary, that's the toughest thing to do, and they did it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, not to take any, as you said, take any credit away from what they built, but obviously it sounds like you have looked at what they did and thought, how does this apply, and what kind of business do you want to run, and kind of take some lessons learned from that model. So you're partnering with corporate. So you're really, as you said, this isn't necessarily a brand new model. It's not something that's like, crazy, but what makes DWELLOptimal unique, and like, what's your differentiator? What's that big value proposition as to what you know and do better than anyone else that's in this space?
That's a great question. And, I guess I'd say two things. One is we have singularity of focus. All we're looking to do is do business for businesses. So for instance, if you go to our website, there isn't a booking engine. There's a reason we only do business with businesses. So we want to put corporates under contract with us. One of the problems I see with branded real estate these days is, and there's plenty of incumbents out there that are doing a great job, but they ultimately are all things to all people. You can be a business traveler. You can be, if you're going to Austin for the weekend, there's plenty of companies, apartment hotels is what we call them in branded real estate, prerequisites for background checks to some degree, but ultimately anybody can book these. So if you think about it, you got a multifamily building whose tenants are, existing, have families, they're sharing elevator space with transient travel. That doesn't always play well. It hasn't played well. There's plenty of instances in some of these tier one cities, Miami, for example, where there's a bevy of lawsuits in and around this quality control aspect of that. So we're trying to solve for that by saying, listen, we're doing one thing. We're going and we're building out effective hybrid work live apartments for corporates only, employees only. And the other innovation, I don't know if I'd call it innovation, we're very interested and we're passionate about connecting the remote traveler to their respective HQ environment. So a lot of what we've done is software based. We have a physical design that we can offer developers, but what I'm personally proud about is what we've been able to accomplish connecting remote work and facilitating remote work. It's not just a stand-up desk. There is a lot that goes into making technology work for you in a remote way. If you think about the three things that companies are obsessing about, if you talk to human capital management professionals, number one, and there's not even a close second, is health and well-being, right? That's the number one. You don't get to number two, right? So they want to solve for that, particularly in a COVID environment. The second priority that we're finding on the campaign trail for this is IT vulnerability and solving for that. Because if you think about it, remote work involves remote access, which involves networks that aren't secure. So we've spent an awful lot of time spending and thinking about how do we create a more secure infrastructure for remote work. Nothing's perfect, but there's certainly, I promise you this, we'll create more secure environments than what you have at home as a user. And lo and behold, a lot of people are working from home. So there's a lot that can be done there. And then finally, there's this business continuity, right? How do you create, and we're doing some specific work as it relates to ESG and human capital management. How can we facilitate remote work to be inclusive in nature? The inclusivity of being remote, we all feel it. If you're working for an organization and you are a remote employee, it's very difficult to feel included to the on-premise worker because you're not there. So how do we create that? That's a technology issue. It's a personnel, it's a human capital issue. So we're solving for that too. So those are the three things that, if you ask me, that we're bringing to market that are pretty exciting.
Yeah, no, thanks, Craig. Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, health and safety being first and foremost a top priority, and wellness and you know, security. There's so many different things. You know, every time you decide to connect to a Starbucks Wi-Fi, you're just opening a can of worms in terms of security and needing VPNs and all kinds of stuff to try to at least shore up your connection. So it's really, really interesting. What have you learned throughout this kind of process, or what are some of the key things that you've learned building DWELLOptimal?
Well, and I would argue that I'm certainly still learning. As a first-time founder, man, there's so much to learn. And that's the first observation I would give you is, and don't be afraid to ask the question. And I have the community that we're in, William, that we're sharing together at SLP, but there's so many instances of this where, you know, other founders are just willing to help. And that's one thing I can tell you. That wasn't my experience on Wall Street necessarily. It was the exception, not the norm, for people to get out of their way to help you. And I found the converse to be true in sort of this entrepreneurial vein. What am I learning? I'm learning that, you know, to be effective, you really need a team around you that is effective. So I know that sounds, you know, basic, but the reality is you're as good as your team. So all the cliches are true. And I think we spend a lot of time trying to find the right talent. And I'll take effort and attitude over talent any day. So, you know, I actually created a formula for myself. Results equal effort plus attitude plus talent, but in that order, right? I think I will take effort and attitude over talent. Talent, to some degree, comes from hard work. You get good at something if you work at it. And so nobody's, you know, deriving black shoals here. We don't need high telemetry horsepower. What we need is effort and attitude. So that's one thing that I've learned is that, you know, surround yourself with people that really want to get there with you, and you'll get there faster.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Craig. And I like that formula. So you said effort plus attitude plus talent in that order is what equals results. How do you search for that? Like, I'm curious, like, how do you find people that fit that mold? What do you look for, whether it's in an interview process, or how can other people kind of apply this framework to their own businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in fact, we're trying to sort of dial that in now. We created the formula internally, and we're sort of living by it. And as we screen for applicants, and by the way, I should tell you that we're still very much, you know, off a startup. So we have plenty more hiring we hope to do to dial this in. But, you know, really being somewhat sort of process driven as it relates to hiring and asking these questions specifically in interviews trying to get to this sort of the makeup of the individual, because it's really hard. Everybody's going to tell you in an interview, I work hard and I have a good attitude, right? I mean, you're not going to come in and say anything other than that, but it's up to us to sort of suss that out, if you will. On the hard skill side, we just ask the question, like, are you proficient on a scale of 1 to 5? Are you a 5 in sort of using spreadsheets, working with Excel? And if you are, then we're going to ask you a whole other set of questions. But if you self-assess at a 3, then maybe we're not going to ask you what you've done in terms of building macros and working in VBA, right? But we look for 4s and 5s in hard skill areas. That's just to get the interview, right? We'll screen that out, and we'll find out very quickly if you're I guess, flowering up your skill set, because we will ask specific questions as it relates to hard skills. But then on the effort and the attitude side, well, that's where the art meets the science, or the science meets the art, you know what I mean? And teasing that out, asking the tough questions, like, what's the hardest thing you've ever done, right? How long was the longest day you ever put in? And why were you there for 18 hours, and was it productive? So these are the sort of things over time. If you create the environment for success, my belief is you will be successful. So it's as simple as that.
Yeah. No, I like that, Craig. Yeah, creating that environment where you can have success makes a lot of sense. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, because this is something that you mentioned effort, attitude, those come before the talent, but it sounds like you're actually screening for the talent to some degree first. And the only reason I'm putting this out there is because I think that's how most traditional like hiring works, where it's around, well, let's qualify for all the skills. But I've also started to hear in certain pockets of like the startup world where it's like, well, actually, we're starting to screen for culture before we even look at some of the other pieces. And again, I don't know what there's a right way. I don't know if you could end up. So again, I'm just, I just to kind of, have kind of a dialogue here. I'm curious, because that's a very different approach. And again, the natural inclination is almost like, do you meet these qualifications first before you even have the conversation? But then do you end up just screening for the people that maybe aren't quite as talented, and you miss someone who would be the perfect cultural fit and could get there with a little bit of effort? Obviously, different stages of startups, what your needs are, but that's just a thought that I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, you're calling me out, aren't you, Will? Let me rephrase on that. I mean, listen. It's a bit of a misnomer what I said. Talent is the given, right? We'd like to think you don't get the interview unless you at least self-assess that you're talented, right? And then we will do what we can to sort of suss that out in the interview. So talent is the given. We don't want anybody around that doesn't have the hard skill sets to be here. And, I hearken back to my Wall Street days. I mean, I first started as a summer associate at Goldman Sachs, and they famously like to tell people that they have the hardest summer associate sort of interview process there is, at least back in the day. And, to get through that, I think I had 14 interviews for that summer. And it was actually, they claim it was harder to get that job than it was to get a full-time job because of the number of MBAs that were looking to put that on their resume. So, but going through that, and, I remember one of the interviews I had, they asked me what my favorite song was. And I vividly remember who asked me. That person's still in the industry. And then they asked me to sing it. So that was above and beyond what I would ever ask somebody to do. But there's always that element of taking the piss. And I certainly felt that during those interviews. But getting back to sort of performance driven, we want to find talent first and foremost. We get that. But we kind of think that's the prerequisite to get here. And now it's all about effort assessment. It's all about attitude assessment. That's where the art meets the science.
Sure. No, that makes sense, Craig. And yeah, I threw that back on you, but just, there's a base level, right? If you don't have certain skill sets, then you're not going to be able to do a job. So it makes sense.
Correct.
That you've got to meet those qualifications. And then from there, it's the other pieces of the puzzle. When you think about the future of DWELLOptimal, where are you today, and what do you need in order to get to that next stage of the company?
Well, we're hard launching the product here in 2022. We would have liked to have hard launched in 2021, but the COVID kind of kept us from being effective to some degree. Can't blame it all on COVID, but it made it. I think every startup had a difficult time sort of operating in that environment. But we're looking for corporate, not volunteers, but pilots that want to be thinking about moving the needle for and creating a more effective working environment for their remote employees. And we're finding them. It turns out this is resonating amongst human capital professionals. They realize they've been mandated by their C-suite, and that this is a number one priority, or not, if not number one in a top 5. Let's figure out what we're doing as it relates to our space, right? And how, and the other thing we're seeing on the campaign trail for this is almost every Fortune 500 company that has an operational footprint in New York City is assessing their need to be here. Their commitment is probably still to the city, but they can take, say, half their middle and back office and stick them in Jacksonville, Florida, or Dallas, Texas. So this co-location phenomenon is happening real time, and we believe we have a pretty interesting solution for that. We're a part of that solution. So it's about building our corporate roster. It's also about finding sort of forward-thinking developers that want to build for work and live, and a more sort of seamless solution for that. So on both sides of the aisle, we need developers that want to develop, and we need corporates that want better spaces. We're finding that.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. And you mentioned tier one cities, you mentioned New York. Where are you focused right now from a location perspective, to get a little more context as to who may be a good fit, and like what does that look like from like the actual geos that you're focused on?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're just launching, so we have found traction in North. What you're finding in a lot of these cities is there's always that, whether it's the Grove in Nashville or Frisco in Dallas, or basically all of Austin. You have these sort of hot zones, if you will, that people want to live, but they want the same sort of commonality of experience. This mixed use sort of revolution is what I call it. You gotta. It feels a lot like New York. I've lived in New York for 18 years on and off, and with an 8-year stint in Asia, but New York has always felt like New York. Now what I'm seeing is a lot of these other cities, and this is no revelation, they want to create the same sort of neighborhood aspect. So you have the Soul Cycle, you have the Sweet Green, you have Joe and the Juice, and you have Equinox. You have all these brands that proliferate, and creating that same ecosystem in Austin. And so lo and behold, you're seeing these mixed use projects with a lot of the same brands. We think we play nicely with all of it, and building a more elevated for work experience as it relates to remote work is what we're up to.
Awesome. Makes a lot of sense, Craig. So when you think about success for DWELLOptimal, and what do you consider success? Like, how would you define that for you and the business?
Survival? No, I'm kidding. But in all honesty, I mean, like, listen, the success of any startup is if the books are true, the brands that truly survive are bringing something innovative to the equation, in my opinion. They're ultimately, they have a survivorship instinct embedded in them. We have found it to be challenging to get the audience within sort of the corporate arena to really dial in. COVID did a lot for us in terms of creating a priority. We have to solve for this now. Whereas before COVID, when we started this exercise, it was like, this is a nice to have. It would be great to give our workers something a little bit more competitive to work out of. It perhaps can help us in the attraction and retention game, but it's not needed. Now it's like, okay, 80% of our workforce is mailing it in from home. There are some productivity declines. What can we do about it? So we're a part of that equation now. So I think, to answer your question, for us to be successful, we need to make sure our messaging is dialed in, and that we're delivering the services that we say we are. So it's being true to your ethos, and we believe we have been.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, Craig. And I've had the experience where, internet goes out, you're and all that stuff, and that cuts everything off. So it makes sense wanting to be able to have, something that's reliable, sustainable, and something that works, so that you don't have that loss of productivity. So I always like to kind of wrap these up and do a few questions around personal finance. Obviously, having spent time on Wall Street, you're probably very comfortable having conversations about personal finance, but that's, what I do with Ostrich is starting to have some of these conversations. So I'd love to kind of understand how you would describe your relationship with money today.
Yeah, it's evolved, certainly. I mean, I feel like to some degree, that's a personal question, certainly. My relationship with money has traditionally been, you store away savings on a yearly basis commensurate with your bonus. That was sort of how Wall Street worked. You had your salary that basically got you through the year, and you kind of lived on a budget based on your salary. And then the bonus was a kind of a nice building savings vehicle embedded, so you could store that away if need be. Some people spent half their bonus and saved half their bonus. It was a little bit more formulaic when I was, working in finance, because you could kind of plan for that every year, with variability, of course, in terms of how you got paid performance-wise. But, you usually were able to squirrel something away each year. I think as a founder, you start to think about cash flows a little differently. You think about things like burn rates and, what economic realities. You have a team that you're paying, so, and then you wonder, like, if the funding doesn't get in by, say, third quarter, how much of this am I going to have to start kidding up for, that kind of thing. So all of that has changed my perspective of money to some degree, I think. But personally, I've always tried to adhere to your heuristic of putting a certain amount of your say performance for the way. You can't touch it, it's there, it's nest egging as you go along, and the rest of it is you set up a budget for yourself that is consistent with what you want out of life, but ultimately what you can afford out of life too.
Yeah. No, I like that. That makes a lot of sense, right? Yeah, taking that, if you're comfortable living on that base salary, it's sort of what I did too in sales. You have that variability, right, as well, where it's like, you might have a commission check, you might not. And so being able to take that and use that as an extra bonus to boost savings versus being what you rely on for your, kind of everyday. So makes a lot of sense. Craig, what would you say is the best investment that you've made?
I've made investments. The best investments I've made are things that I can't touch for 10 years, right? Like, and they're sort of self-imposed prisons of, if you go into a private equity fund that has a 7-year gate and you're like, all right, I'm not allowed to pull it out because I'm infamous for, because I was a trader and I watched every single tick and I lived, close to close, if you will, as we say. It is so easy to take a look at Bloomberg and see what's happening today and be like, all right, I'm nervous, I'm out. The best investments are the ones that you have to set it and forget it. I used to call them, in Asia, we say, buy it and go to Bali. Just don't think about it, let it accrue. And, the market has been accommodated for that kind of strategy, the buy and hold forever. There's reasons for that structurally. Obviously, the Fed and the ECB and all these central banks have colluded to create this easy money scenario. QE1, QE2, all this stimulus has been stimulating, but now we're starting to see the end point of this. Inflation is coming in to play in a massive way. I don't think it's obvious to anybody here what's next. This is new territory for me. Certainly, I haven't seen inflation tick up like this in my, I guess, in recent memory. So, be interesting to see what happens in 2022.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I like that. Yeah, the set it and forget it, right? As you said, the system's kind of set up to benefit people that just stay in the market long term.
Correct.
And, essentially take a wide view of the central banks are going to continue to support the economy and make sure things are flowing. On the other side, Craig, we don't always make good decisions. So what would you say is one of the dumbest money mistakes that you've made?
Bitcoin circa 2018. I was one of the guys that top ticked that at 20,000 or close to it, and believed in the story. Still, to some degree, believe it as a storage of value proposition. I haven't spent recent time, although I dug pretty deep back in 17 and 18 and built out a thesis related to crypto. I'm not up on it these days because I've been sort of myopic about Dwell. But from a timing perspective, it was poor timing on our part and my part. And I look back and wish I had been a little bit more. When markets are up, say, 100% in 6 months, that's not the time to be out there grabbing for things. I knew that going in, but it's that FOMO, right? You're like, this thing could be 100,000. The asset class is a tenth of what gold was at the time, I believe, or was something around that. And there was a lot of there were a lot of factors that made sense. They still make sense, but as to where that comes out in the wash with all the regulatory frameworks that are trying to sort of hone it in, I'm glad to some degree I'm not spending a lot of time on that. I do think it's a again, buy it and go to Bali scenario. If you believe in that asset class, don't try to mastermind it, hold and see what happens in the next 5 to 10 years. This is not a crypto discussion, but I think it'll be very interesting in 2022 as to how that asset class does.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if you would have, as you said, bought it and gone to Bali, then even between 2017 to now, you'd be up, if it was at 20,000, you'd be up 100%, right? But it has already come down from whatever it was at the highs, 65K or something like that, or last year. So it all, as you said, it's that timing, and who knows what'll happen with regulatory stuff. And you've got interest from NFTs that are driving more interest back into crypto. So it's an interesting time. But who knows where we end up.
Yes, exactly.
Craig, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you sitting down. I want to leave you with the last word. So if there's anything that you want to share, any ask from the audience, please, you've got the floor. And then also let everyone know how they can connect with you outside of this podcast.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if I have anything specific in nature in the way of an ask. We're happy to have conversations both with developers, that are thinking in mixed use terms and in hybrid work terms. I think we have a lot to say as it relates to that. We've innovated to some degree on design and software. The way to contact me, I guess, do people give out emails? Is that typically what you see, or?
It's up to you, whatever you're comfortable with. Yeah, some people are fine with it.
Yeah, we have, if you email info@dwelloptimal.com, info@dwelloptimal.com, our CRM will pick that up. And if you have specific questions related to our offering, we're always in the market to talk to both investors, developers, and corporates. So those are the three areas that we concentrate on: investors, corporates, and developers. So if you're one of those three, we'd love to hear from you. How's that?
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you, Craig. I really appreciate you sitting down and sharing some of your insights and what you're building at Dwell Optimal.
Thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
On your way out, please share the podcast with others. It's the only way that the community grows and others hear these incredible stories from entrepreneurs and top performers. And of course, pound that subscribe button so you get notified when episodes drop every Friday. I'm William Glass, CEO and co-founder of Ostrich, and of course, your host of the Silicon Alley Podcast. Have a very profitable day.
You got no time to waste, but still you hesitate. Caught in a circle saying, I'll never leave this place. Some words got you searching for the bright side over and over.